Hello, folks, and welcome back to another Hallowoods weekly Q&A behind-the-scenes backstage live stream extravaganza affair. Thank you so much for tuning in, as always, not just to the show itself, but to these behind-the-scenes snippets. If you are watching this from the present day, you are able to click into YouTube and submit questions in the chat. And after we've gotten through our patron ask box of questions, then we will address any in the chat that I can. If you're watching this in the far future, I hope it's nice, and you can probably toss questions into a similar patrons ask box, and it will probably get answered on a similar Q&A stream like this. It may be a shorter Q&A live stream today, just because there's not a ton of news this week as we roll into the sort of holiday season. It's just, I suppose, which encompasses everything from the various Thanksgivings of the world all the way to New Year's. But behind the scenes of the show this week, we are really just working through these last 3 episodes before we go on our holiday break. And this week was a lovely little sort of not detour exactly, but this week was a nice diversion from sort of the pile of ongoing plot lines that season 5 has kicked up. And I really enjoy every time that like a sort of format break episode rolls around. Although there's a diverse array of different episode formats and things that we've seen recently, especially across all of season 4. But that said, I really enjoyed getting to work on this week's. It's one that's been brewing for a little bit. And maybe showcase just corners of the world that we haven't gotten to see a whole lot of yet. And so it is maybe a little unfortunate that, like, these places I've gotten to visit in real life, their representation in the show is when they are in a sort of post-apocalyptic destroyed period. But nevertheless, it is fun to get to expand the horizons a little bit. I know one of the things I recall from listeners back in like season 1, season 2, was just that, we don't see a lot of the world through the Hallowoods, which sensibly the Hallowoods is focused on one particular forest region. But it is nice now that we get to kind of, as the show goes on, slowly expand the scope of where we see kind of more of the world. And to some extent, there's a little bit of mystery in that as well that I like, that we're going to get to sort of begin to explore what has happened to various places. And it's not necessarily common knowledge in the world of the show. Intercontinental communication has become a little bit more difficult than it used to be outside of the odd ham radio operator. So I do look forward to getting to explore a little bit more of this landscape, but starting in with this kind of special episode I really enjoyed. Other than that, we are still now, I think, 2 or 3 weeks in to, I guess, 2 solid weeks and change into Canada's like nationwide postal strike. Briar Lily in the chat says, "Hello, this week's episode was, I'm so glad you enjoyed it." I definitely like, we're not far into season 5, so it's maybe a little bit early to spend an episode just focusing on one thing, but I really enjoyed getting to work on this one and kind of writing up the story. So I'm excited both just to have that piece out kind of standing on its own, but then also there were some implications for our sort of Europe crew that are sort of carried by the waves of season 4. So I cannot wait to dive a little bit more into their situation. But I'm also looking forward to the coming weeks, as within these last 3 episodes before we go on kind of our holiday break. We've got we've got still a lot of things to not tie up exactly, but check in on, and a lot of drama unfolding in Scout City slash the Scout Post, as we start to get an angle on what kind of the continuation of our mystery from last season, and then also what our gang of familiar faces is going to do now that they're the ones kind of left to tackle this problem. So it should be a fun time. After the next 3 episodes, that will be 8 episodes in total into season 5. We will be on a little bit of a holiday break for something around a month to a month and a half. I think it will be back in either the end of January or very early February, in order to give me some time to move abodes behind the scenes and set up a recording studio somewhere else. But that will be kind of that's really probably the biggest thing coming up on the horizon for the show. That said, I think the other things that on the go at the moment are just getting those 3 episodes done, waiting for Canada's mail system to return. Is something, I believe 55,000 postal workers are on strike currently, which I hope they get all the asks and demands thereafter. But in the meantime, I think now about 10 million or more packages have not been shipped and or cannot be shipped, which sadly includes the entire the entire bundle of patron merch and sketch commissions that I currently have. With the as that length of time grows increasingly long, I need to figure out how to get mail to people otherwise. But I'm still very thankful for everyone who has ordered sketch commissions, and I hope I can get those to you all soon. I think lastly is just working ahead on various sort of novel projects, but a couple of those are just slowly ticking along in the back burner. 100 Eyes in the Dark continues to sort of churn its way in the publishing industry, and possibly we'll go back into more tinkering come February, March, but we will see. But the hope is definitely probably sometime by mid-summer next year, to have some firmer dates and things that I can share about, where the book will come out and how it will be available, and, just where its home in the world will be. Hopefully wherever that home is also a home for other novels to follow, but something increasingly possible as well. I will be aiming for traditional self-publishing for most novel work if I can, but for shorter pieces that are maybe a story that I think would be interesting to tell in 10,000 words or 20,000 words, but wouldn't be of a publishing length, I might consider alternate avenues, such as self-publishing, or publishing through some platform of my own, in order to get those out there. We'll contemplate that over the year to come. Still on shelves is where I would like most books, but we shall see. Because there are a lot of story concepts I would love to tackle, but also making each of those into books is like a multi-year process. So we'll see if every one of them makes it out to a feature-length presentation, or whether there's something shorter and smaller I can do to get some of these stories out in the meantime in a manageable form. Especially there are some books that I think I would love to write, and I know Hallowoods listeners would probably love to read, but I don't know about the mass market appeal of everything, so we'll see. Not that mass market appeal is ever something that most Hallowoods adjacent stuff is ever really going to hold. At least up until we get like a Scavenger's Reign style Netflix show someday. That said, we do have one question in the Patrons Ask box, in which I will get to. And then after that, I will go to any that are in chat. So the question that Lizard has from the Ask box is one that I have not seen asked before, which is, did any characters have different names when you originally created them to the name they have in the show? Um, the answer for some is yes, and then the answer for others is that they are not. It's not that the character was renamed, but that there was a preceding character in some other story that they stole a lot of vibes from. That the preceding character had a different name. So I think one of the ones that comes to mind is that for a brief, terrible couple of weeks, Solomon Reed was going to be Amadeus Reed. And that lasted all through my early drafts. And then it got to the point of writing the episode where he shows up in the show. And that was the point where I realized, like, if I write a mystery character, and the mystery of like who the instrumentalist is was very present in a couple of early episodes. But if I write a short story where a character named Amadeus shows up out of the blue in the forest with these injuries that the instrumentalist got in the last episode, like, no, the reveal is not gonna surprise anybody. It was like this name is gonna be way too on the nose, even for me. And so he ended up with a more biblical name, and a name that could personify his sort of Old Testamentness a little bit more, and also just be a little bit less obvious than than it was at the start. And so Solomon Reed was born, and Solomon Reed, not even plays innocent, but just is kind of out of it for his most of his appearance in the show, up until he kidnaps Zelda. And the payoff there, I think, was much better on account of him not being named after a famous composer from the beginning. So that is probably one example. I think, surprisingly, Diggory Graves probably always was Diggory Graves, but that their character was a little bit different early on. Because I think in their very first doodlings, Diggory Graves was frankly a lot more like we see them in season 5, which was just a lot more put together, a lot more content with themselves. They had a lot of answers. And I really liked the picture of like a Frankenstein's monster that was made of all these different parts and had all these different facets of their identity, but had kind of come to terms with all those parts and had found kind of a peaceful unison of all those things about identity and memory and gender coexisting. And so I really liked that concept. But then when it came to writing the show, it was like, okay, well, if this character has already reached nirvana from the start, it's not going to be as like there's nowhere for them to go in quite the same way. And so for Diggory's early character, even though the name stayed the same, the character had to change quite a bit. Or not change quite a bit, but just dial way back to the start of that journey. And make that something that we would walk through with their character over time, in order to kind of figure out how they reach that place where they're content. Now, I think there's still other baggage and issues and drama for Diggory to work through in the modern day, but that particular aspect of their identity is in a much better place, and so I've enjoyed the journey there. A couple of characters came in from other stories or were directly not quite inspired by, but like I have many stories that have been written at one point or developed, or like I'd build a world and a cast of characters and a plot, and then just that project wouldn't go anywhere or it wouldn't have an outlet really. And so a couple of characters have gotten moved from those kind of shelved projects into the Hallowoods, or very similar characters have been written in the Hallowoods that reflect some of those characters. Um, I think Olivier Song was written for the Hallowoods, but the concept of a wizard who has like a blue weather shifting garment came from a like urban supernatural story called Superbia, an Adam Punk urban supernatural story called Superbia. And in Superbia, there was going to be I think, a, a depressed middle aged wizard named Scott Nimbus. And Scott Nimbus was always sad, and thus it was always raining above the apartment complex where Scott lived. And so that character definitely like is a very different one than Olivier. But the concept of I think for Scott, it was like a big scarf that would wrap around most of his body. And for Olivier, it just became a cloak, which is a little bit more like dark academia core. And so, I think that kind of descended into Olivier's cloak and a little bit of their relationship between mood and weather, which was the aspect I think I liked most, anyways, of that primordial wizard character. From the same setting, Superbia, there was a character named Micaiah Morel, and Micaiah Morel was a antique collector, which sounds exceedingly similar to the Museum of Broken Promises, except that Micaiah Morel was just like an actual normal business person. Um, he was still also made of mushrooms, and kind of wore these dark, like round pilot glasses to hide his photosensitive eyes. And he was sort of a assistant, best friend, co-conspirator with the main characters. But I think the big difference with Micaiah versus Mix Morel is that Micaiah had much more of a temper and wasn't really a therapeutic character, so much as maybe more of like a Squidward almost. This was a pitch for an animated show, and then also was just a real world businessman and not a sort of on a cosmic mission. Strangely enough, although the name has changed, Rothagroth the Decaying Crown was once, it might have been, I think it was Rotshamble Evernorthy, who was a similar character in that setting. And oddly enough, the relationship between Rothagroth and Mix Morel and the relationship between Rotshamble and Micaiah it's a very similar relationship. So they kind of almost came in as a duo in from Superbia into the Hallowoods. Which means that if Superbia does ever see the light of day someday, it's going to just have a different character where that Micaiah shaped hole used to be, because I can't do the same character twice. But I've enjoyed Mix Morel getting to live his mushroom manifest destiny through the Hallowoods setting instead. Hector Mendoza was inspired by a very strange character from a very strange setting. It was a setting based loosely on Grimm's fairy tales, and specifically on it's a Germanic fairy tale. It's a specific Grimm's fairy tale, and it's a Grimm's fairy tale that gets adapted in a film called The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. And in the event, which is a very strange film, I think Robin Williams is in that film, but yeah, I don't know if he's credited. And it's a beautiful, weird film. But it is essentially a fairy tale about a larger than life folk hero captain recruiting a group of people with basically fairy tale superpowers. So there's a guy that can breathe in real big and then blow out a hurricane. There's a guy who can run really fast, et cetera, et cetera. And there's like an expert sharpshooter who can hit any shot and that sort of thing. And so from that came a story that might have. I can't remember if it was called anything. It might have just been called Grimm or something related to that. And strangely enough, it was a bunch of sort of fairy tale inspired people fighting a species of bionic porcelain factory made automatons of some kind. And they showed up a lot in early stories. But their leader was a guy named Hector Grimm, and he had, for some reason, the same green sweater. And so Hector Mendoza doesn't have a lot in common with him, except for the aesthetic, the outfit, and the attitude, the cadence, especially. But Hector coming in the Hallowoods with his dogs, with his scavenging business, with kind of his like intrepid adventurer thing. So yeah, oddly enough, he came in from a story that was way, way different in terms of genre, but kind of that core like down to earth cynicism a little bit is really the main thing that carried through from him to the Hallowoods version of that character. Refrigerator in the chat says, "Hello, how is everyone?" Well, I assume, or as well as can be under the circumstances. Let's see. Did any other characters have different names to the name they have in the show? I think those are probably some of the more notable examples that come to mind. I'm trying to think if I've stolen anyone else from various places. I think there are a couple characters in the show that lived in like. It's not that their name changed, but their their media changed. There's a couple characters that I think began as characters in various Dungeons and Dragons campaigns once upon a time, who just had a notable moment as an NPC in one of those games, and it was like, all right, I've got to keep that same character. I've got to give that more life someplace else. So Fox, I believe, out of Moth's like sort of Las Vegas Raiders caravan survivor group was, I think, originally a Curse of Strahd druid of Yester Hill at one point. And the St. Loris is a character that has lived on in different forms in a couple of different ongoing stories as well. Especially when there is a sort of a sainthood in Baldur's Gate to uphold. But these characters are, of course, distinct in their own Hallowoods fashion, but often the Hallowoods, because it is such a massive kind of expansive world of characters, and because the potential for things to exist is so high, sometimes characters kind of trickle through from other stories to find, or for a version of them, or a someone along a similar vibe to find a home in the story. But for every one of those, there's now like for instance, in Superbia, I think we probably won't have a mushroom character if that's the story ever gets made. But maybe a flower character instead, a legally distinct antiques collector. Refrigerator in the chat says, actually, I have a question. I have not listened to all the episodes yet, but can you tell me, are Ray and Moth returning for motivation? Spoilers for season 5 ahead, but yes, they certainly are. And especially with a lot of Hallowoods characters, it is sometimes that we see them in the spotlight for a time, and then maybe sometimes they take a back seat while we worry about other storylines or other parts of the world. But the intention is not to drop too many of these threads that we start. So a lot of the time we'll get to revisit with someone eventually and kind of catch up to what they've been doing in the meantime while our plot was raging elsewhere. But yes, I'm very fond of Ray and Moth. Two kind of great American horror tropes caught up in that duo. And Ray is just a delightful character to write. I enjoy his dialogue and cadence and way of speaking so much. And I'm excited to get into more of his backstory, which we have not really touched much on. But he's got so much history to unpack and kind of to share. So I'm looking forward to getting to check in with our increasingly vintage automobile. But yeah, other than that, I think that will bring us to the end of our Q&A for today, everybody. So thank you so much for checking in. Thanks to those in the chat for dropping questions. And I'll be catching you up next week for more Q&As and also our continuing season 5 episodes. So until then, catch you soon, everybody. Take care.